Hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel Unchanged, where we're looking at Jhumpa Lahiri's novel The Lowlands, especially in relation to the role of gender and performative identity in a transcultural setting. So we just continue where we left off from, and on your screen should be a section on gender and mobility, because it's a novel about mobility, about transcultural liminal passages across space and time. So, an important coordinate of the present analysis is the relation between mobility, space, and gender, with a focus on the transgressive potential of women's motion. So, I've mentioned this already, but it's worth repeating that this essay is chosen for this course because it also gives us a vocabulary from critical theory and culture studies, which may be usefully integrated in a study of the text and context in this course, because we have a section on the role of critical theory, the role of literary theory, and an understanding of the relationship between novel and change. So I think this essay on his with his engagement with gender and performativity and transculturality and different forms of mobility apropos of identity really serves that purpose very well. So mobility research has been concerned with gender since the 1970s, resulting in studies on immigration, work, generational mobility, the relation between space, gender, and mobility. So we can see how this kind of an entanglement, which this essay provides, really makes it very useful, not just study Lahiri's novel, which is what we're doing, but also the other component of this course in terms of looking at the vocabulary and the interpretative, interventions from critical theory and literary theory. The patriarchal outlook on gender relations involves a traditional binarism that associates women with the private sphere and men with the public sphere or the public domain. So there is that very essentialized binary or dualism which confers certain kind of gender location to certain kind of spaces. So the public space belongs to men, the private space belongs to women. So that segregation is very problematic, obviously, is used in many representations of revolution, of different mobility movements, etc. Right now, which is why I find, and the same could be said about nervous conditions as well, how the female agency and female enactment of subversion can sometimes take place in very, very private spaces, and sometimes as private as the body, which is why when we look at anorexia and bulimia and hysteria in Dangarembga's novel, we find that even in the body at that point of time becomes a site of subversion because of the rejection and refusal to engage with the public space narrative of subversion, so that it gets directed back into the domestic, into the corporeal, right? So we find something similar happening in Lowlands as well. So according to Macy, this dual perspective has also been coded as a space/feminine versus time/masculine opposition. So time or temporality has often been gendered male, because it is, it quickly lends itself to the normative, productive notion of temporality in terms of functional, rational, temporal, productive quality, whereas space, which is traditionally seen as more fluid, is sometimes very conveniently classified as feminine. In other words, female identity is associated with a static condition, the antithesis of mobility, while men stand for dynamic temporality, history, progress, civilization, etc. Now, this notion of mobility is a very progress-oriented notion of mobility, and mobility which must necessarily correspond to development, pro-progress, pro-development, etc., and not the other forms of mobility which may be cyclical, which may be elliptical in quality, right? Here we have a linearity of mobility, which quickly connects to notions of progress, notions of development. So connected to or corresponding to different, coordinates and verticals about history, civilization, nationhood, etc. An association of women with the private sphere has also meant the limitation of their mobility as an important mechanism of subordination. So this also becomes a strategy of subordination, a strategy of segregation. Consequently, women's access to a mobile condition entails the potential to dismantle patriarchal conventions by subverting normative gender discourses, acquiring new subjectivity, and gaining social mobility and sexual freedom. So you can see how sexuality, spirituality, and mobility, they're all connected together. And this triangulation really corresponds to new notions of embodiment, new notions of subjectivity, and new notions of agency. Despite the freeing connotations of female mobility, theoreticians caution against the risk of creating a new binarism that would render it superior to a settled condition. Thus, one should consider that not all kinds of movement are inherently beneficial, and that we should not trade the myth of the sedentary lifestyle, border and frontier, territory and proximity for the myth of mobility, flows and networks. There is also the cautionary stance one should take against looking at mobility as something which is essentially opposite to static qualities. So mobility can also create stagnation. Mobility can also create regression. Mobility can also create some loss of agency or an erasure of agency. Instead, one should take into account the layered and elusive nature of the concept of mobility, considering manners in which it can be positively and negatively coded either as progress, freedom, modernity, or restricted movement, vigilance, and control. So you can see how, again, the opposition categories can sometimes converge and merge with each other. How notions of negative coding, notions of mobility can correspond to progress, freedom, liberation, emancipation, modernity, but also it can equally correspond, it can be weaponized through functions such as surveillance, functions such as restriction of movement, functions such as vigilance, and so on and so forth. Acknowledging these nuanced interpretations of mobility, the analysis of the primary corpus aims to reveal the stratified range of valences illustrated by Gori's nomadic condition. So the nomadic quality of Gori is important for us to understand here. And this nomadicity is important because it becomes a function of her identity. The fact that she is always moving, but not through the temporal linearity which subscribes to a male idea of movement. Instead, we see in Gori a sense of unpredictability from the lenses of patriarchy, from the lenses of heteronormative functional temporality, right? Which is why her movement becomes so important and so subversive in very, very strategic ways. While also moving away, while also resisting any public space orientation towards mobility or any public space validation or public validation of mobility or subversion, because that validation comes from a very, more often than not, a very male side of rebellion, subversion, etc., which is rejected by Gori in this novel. Nomadic itineraries and female disempowerment. So you can see how it keeps coming. We saw that earlier as well in the previous session, how empowerment can also become disempowerment. So the borders between empowerment and disempowerment are not really always very neatly drawn out. So nomadism has been glorified as a new paradigm for thinking subjectivity with a focus on de-territorialization, movement, and connectivity. So de-territorialization becomes a really important word over here because that becomes some kind of a potential freedom, a potential breaking away from the contours of classification, contours of a coded identity. This approach promotes nomadology and as an epistemological condition of mobility that enables the crumbling of conceptual foundations, promoting a logic of the and, illustrating all manner of becoming. So nomadism really becomes a more and-oriented, a more interconnected, intersubjective and intersectional category rather than a binary-oriented category of dualism. So nomadism is associated with a rhizomatic manifestation of travel that involves states of discontinuity, rupture, and multiplicity. So rhizome, of course, some of you know, is a concept which was made famous by Deleuze and Guattari, how the rhizomatic nodal points where convergences and divergences happen sometimes simultaneously becomes a very important metaphor of the postmodern, post-structuralist identity formations and reformations. And that same structure of discontinuity, rupture, and multiplicity are brought back here in the engagement with space apropos of a nomadic identity. So, nomadic practices have been envisaged as acts of resistance against hegemonic control over space as well as over the subject and its socio-cultural location, right? So it can become an act of resistance, and it can become an act of retelling, an act of deconstruction. Feminism has taken over the nomadic vocabulary. So, unsurprisingly, the nomadic vocabulary can find an ally in feminism, in post-colonial studies, and so on and so forth. So, we can see how at the heart of the essay is a very serious and sophisticated engagement with literary theory, with critical theory, which is why we read this in some details, because it also serves the other function that was promised as part of the course content, looking at how critical theory, literary theory can also be used and applied for a course which seeks to study the relationship between text and context in terms of novel and change. So, unsurprisingly, the nomadic vocabulary has also interacted with some of the tenets of feminism to highlight the movement's acute awareness of the non-fixity of boundaries. So, this is Rosie Braidotti, for instance, who's also a scholar writing from the post-human feminist position. More specifically, feminist critics uphold nomadic transgression as a strategy of trespassing established borders in order to create new subjectivity. So, the new ontology of subjectivity, which is a function, a performative function, an iterative function, they all become part of the nomadic discourse at play. In other words, the adoption of nomadic theory by feminism enables the production of rhizomatic constellations of multiple identities and affiliations as a transgressive strategy that goes against fixity and limiting structure. So there's a delimiting quality about nomadic subjectivity, which is rhizomatic in quality. And again, if you remember your Deleuze and Guattari, which obviously this essay draws on, we can find that how the rhizome becomes a really interesting structure as well as a strategy. It's an ontology as well as an activity through which differences, through which convergences and divergences, which become the function of identity, can be calibrated, can be studied. Despite the rich implications of conceptual nomadism, one has to apply it cautiously, paying attention to existing critiques. So again, the very moral, ethical thing that this essay does is that just when it's about to become very excited at an intellectual level, talking about nomadic subjectivity or playfulness of time or space, it also gives a cautionary ring in terms of how this can get appropriated from the position of authority. This can be appropriated from the position of power. So one has to be very careful in looking at this from a very polyphonic lens rather than a very mainstream understanding of nomadic subjectivity. So one of the main objections refers to the epistemic violence involved in the Western appropriation of the term, that it faces the specificity of traditional nomadism, right? So the Western appropriation of the term of nomadic subjectivity, the epistemic violence that it can enact in the process, is something that one must be very, very guarded against. So the appropriation from a very Western, Eurocentric position. Thus, several critical voices argue the Western feminists, such as Rosie Braidotti and Chantal Mouffe, have overused the nomadic metaphor, turning it into an idealized condition for mobile intellectuals. So it just ends up becoming some kind of a metaphor for a very privileged presence, a very privileged play of power, a very privileged play of appropriation and rejection and differentiation. And again, what that means is this just becomes some kind of a reified idea that keeps getting shuttled around in a very academic space, which is obviously very privileged in quality, very Western, sometimes very white, very, very elitist kind of a setting. And what this also means is it really denies the real nomad any agency. It really doesn't apply to the real experiential nomadic condition. It just becomes some kind of a very attractive, reified, theoretical category, right? So that's a problem. That's a moral, ethical problem that this essay is also highlighting and cautioning us against. So, while actual nomads, refugees, migrant workers do not belong to the sophisticated picture the Western nomadic intellectuals are defined predominantly by hybridity, transcultural global mobility, and agency. So that is the ethical dilemma at work, and it's absolutely important and imperative to highlight this dilemma as well, which makes this essay not just so sophisticated from a perspective of critical theory and literature, but also very ethical and very moral in quality. The fact that it really flags up the dichotomy between what nomadic subjectivity means as a metaphor and how it gets appropriated by very elitist, privileged Western academics who define themselves as nomads, moving across different settings, different forms of interdisciplinarity, whereas the real nomads, as people who can't use this metaphor at all because it doesn't really apply to them at a level of ideas, because it gets so reified and so gentrified at an academic ideational level. And this gentrification of ideas is something which we must pay a lot of attention to at a very cautionary way. So along similar lines, Sten Puls Mosland signals that a valorization of the movement, transformation, nomadism, and fragmentation creates new dichotomies and privileges regimes of mobility over conditions of settlement. Considering the link between mobility, gender, and nomadic transgression, this chapter aims to establish the author's position regarding nomadic displacement and female disempowerment. So this is the momentum, this is the ecology that the essay is trying to espouse in his reading of the lowlands. And again, we can see how there's a continuous and sustained engagement with critical theory, with literary theory, which is absolutely imperative and very useful, I should say, for a course like this, which is why we read this in such details. So what happens to Western individualism, and how does this sort of relate really with South Asian interdependence, apropos of these ideas of nomadic subjectivity and so on? In order to understand the mechanisms of transcultural transformation in the context of South Asian American encounters, the present discussion relies on several studies regarding specific aspects of South Asian and American cultures. So there are these references to other cultures as well, a polyphony of cultures really, and how this idea of subjectivity can be applied differentially, of course, across different cultures. So Harry C. Triandis' socio-psychological investigation establishes that some cultures, the USA and other English-speaking countries, tend to focus on the individual as a basic unit of social perception, while others favor a more group-oriented approach to identity. So there are these demographic, cultural, geopolitical changes in relation to how identity is preferred, the preferred iteration of identity, apropos of culture. So along similar lines, Joanne C. Miller concludes that Americans are more inclined to promote an independent view of the self, while the Hindu Indians privilege an interdependent dimension of identity. So again, the religious, spiritual, cultural angle comes into being in terms of which culture prefers a more communitarian approach to identity, as opposed to certain cultures which, they tend to prefer a more atomistic idea of identity, right? So that again becomes part of how identity is iterated. And when we use the word culture, everything really gets mixed up in that: the weather, the climate, the topography, the soil, the vegetation, the crops. So all these come together, because even something as crops, even something as food, really, they carry a huge amount of content in terms of how cultural identities are articulated, because the food of a certain community can be very shareable in community quality in terms of how it is made, how it is consumed, the different culinary practices which invested in the making of food, the harvest rituals, the agricultural rituals, and how that orients towards a more collective, community-centric idea of identity, as opposed to a culture which produces and consumes food in isolation, not really as an interdependent phenomena. So this play between independence and interdependence really becomes absolutely crucial in our understanding of different forms of identity processes. An important feature that derives from a communitarian tradition is the promotion of a model of female identity as a cluster of roles, that entail the notion of dependence. So, we find that in many situations, in many cultural conditions, the female is given certain roles which are more community centered, which are more to do with nurturing, more to do with the galvanizing force of a home, etc. And of course, what that also means is that it becomes a role it subscribes to a notion of dependence or reliance. So the identity of Hindu woman is not an independent notion, but a series of role relations as daughter, daughter-in-law, wife, and mother. So we have this very complex kinship structures and interdependent structures of identity which correspond to the role of a Hindu woman. Again, it is very, very crucial to locate and situate this identity iteration in a particular cultural context. So according to the Hindu Brahmanical ideology, the primary duties of a Pativrata, a Hindu faithful wife, involve cooking, becoming a mother, and cultivating a passion for a husband. So the reason why this is important is to see how these things get subverted through slow, sometimes strategic processes in Lahiri's lowland. Because if we look at the character of Gauri, for instance, she really moves away from any of these, the connotations and constructs that are prescribed for her. A persistent idea about Hindu women foregrounds their need to be guarded and protected by a male figure, since they are unfit for independence. So again, this very interesting and problematic notion of women always have to be sort of accompanied by a man, or escorted by a man, or protected by a man, also becomes part of the moral vocabulary of the ideal femininity, the ideal womanhood, and so on and so forth. So women are also considered incompatible with the attributes of public life, and therefore confined to the home sphere. So again, the idea of confinement, and this is why space again comes in as a very interesting metaphor. The relegation of the woman into the interior space, the domestic space, as opposed to the access conferred or given to men to the public space. So this play of access and inaccessibility really becomes crucial in any understanding of identity as a function of space, as a function of access, as a function of navigating across spaces. Now, what we also see is how the subversion that takes place in the lowlands is so complex, because at one level, it's a rejection of the public space. It's not that there is a hankering of the public space. It's a rejection of the public space because the slow process of subversion takes place or take place inside the home, like Dangarembga's novel in many situations. At the same time, there's a partial access to public space which takes place with the idea of the university profession, how Gauri goes for a university profession, how she subscribes to a university academic profession, which is obviously one of a public space. So there's a very complex and asymmetrical engagement with different notions of space and time, which become a function of the iteration of identity that takes place in Lahiri's novel. So this basically is the theoretical premise that the chapter sets out to do. So having presented the theoretical framework of this chapter, the argument will continue with the analysis of the primary corpus, highlighting the intersection between transdifference, transculturality, and nomadism in the fabric of Gauri's identity. And that is where the essay will now focus later on. So we'll stop at this point now. We will move on to the reading of the novel directly using this essay, but it's important for us to remember and reconnect with the vocabulary used in the essay so far. I mean, obviously, it's a very sophisticated, elegant essay on the role of gender, space, and identity. It's very heavily plugged into critical theory, literary theory apparatus, that vocabulary, that interpretative lens, that heuristic lens, which is something that we were attempting to do, which we are aiming to do also as part of the course. The way we're dealing with this course also requires engagement with critical theory and literary theory, which this essay serves perfectly in my mind. So we stop at this point today, but we continue reading Lahiri's fiction or in this particular novel using this lens. But I also invite you to sort of use this lens to see how this particular interpretative fabric may be applied to some of the texts we've read so far. I mean, definitely to a text like Dangarembga's nervous conditions, but also Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I mean, to almost all the texts we have read so far, in terms of the absolute disappearance of women in the quasi public spaces, the peri-public spaces in Robinson Crusoe, Great Expectations, for example, and also how this notion of the performative female identity sometimes deconstructs the difference between the public and the private. A good case in point being Arkin Narayan's The Guide. It's such a iconic novel in so many ways, but it also really becomes part of a deconstructive strategy through which the new woman in India can begin to emerge, like Gauri. Rosie in the novel, Narayan's novel, doesn't really subscribe to the tenets which are prescribed for in very, very conservative terms. But at the same time, it's not really an easy and seamless subversion. There's also this interplay between reconsolidation and subversion. So it's not really a perfect subversion, because that would be very, very inauthentic in many ways, because every act of subversion can also contain complicity in it. And we saw that happening in the character of Tambuzai in Dangarama's Nervous Condition, how her subversion also contains complicity, also contains consolidation, and sometimes very covert, sometimes very overt ways. So we'll see all that happening in this complex array of characterization that Lahiri offers us. But we will keep reminding ourselves of this critical theory, literary theory vocabulary that we have done so far in this essay as we move on to a study of the novel in question. So we'll stop at this point today. We'll move on to that specific study of the novel in due course. Thank you for your attention.